Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, Daf Yud Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Ruth Leah Kahan, Jessica Shklar, and Emily Michelson in loving memory of their mother, Kadima Michelson, Kadima Bat Harav Avram Tzvi V'chaya on her 8th year at site. Today's daf is sponsored by Refuah Shlema for Arya Ben Eliza Allah, who is undergoing surgery today. With that, we're going to get started. We had a question yesterday. If you remember, at the end of yesterday's daf, we said, what is the source in the Torah for milta, the Amar Rabbanan, that the rabbis say, milta achezke, that we rely on the presumptive status of the item, whatever it was. We assume that stays until we know otherwise. Okay. Now, there's different terms that are called chazaka. That's one kind of chazaka, which is something stays in its presumptive status. Now we're going to talk about something that's similar but different, another assumption we make. Now, with the idea of chazakah here is that we rely on chazakah is we assume that unless something changed, right, we can go with it stays in that status. We gave it this status, it remains in this status until taken out of its status, which again, we talked about in the context of the treifa. Now we're going to ask another question. Minaha milta da'amur Rabbanan, we're starting at the second line on our daf. Zil batar rubba. Now this seemingly doesn't really connect with our topic, but after a long sugya of 10 answers to this question, it's going to come back to our sugya. But it seems like it's coming up here since they asked the question, well, what's the biblical source for the fact that things remain in their presumptive status? We're now going to ask, what's the biblical source for the fact that we follow the majority? So the first response of the Gemara is, Minala, what do you mean? What's the source for this? Everybody knows the source. The pasuk says we follow the majority. We go by the majority. Okay, that's pretty clear. So what are you asking about? So they answer, no. Wait, there's two kinds of roves that we're discussing. Rubba di'ita kaman, kigon tesha chanuyot v'sanhedrin lo kame bayla. We're not talking about a case where there's a majority in front of us that we can count. Like, okay, we'll start with the simpler one. Sanhedrin. How do you rule in the court? You go by the majority. You count. How many people said this? How many people said that? Right? And we go by the majority. We count 12 versus 11, right? We're going to go by the majority. 2 out of 3. We're going to go by the majority. That we count how many people we have a majority. Tesha chanuyot. You have a piece of meat. There were 9 kosher stores and 1 non-kosher store. We can assume it came from the kosher store. Again, I'm not going to get into all the details of tesha chanuyot. Depends what came from the majority, if it was outside, if it was inside. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all that. But the main thing being, there we can count. There were 9 kosher stores, 1 kosher store. The chances are it came from the kosher store. Okay, and you can follow majority, and that's where we use acharei Rabbi Matot. That's where there's an actual majority in front of us, where we can count it. But so that lo kama bayalan, I wasn't asking about that. That for sure is acharei Rabbi Matot. Ki kama bayalan. The question that we're asking is rubba de leita kaman. If we can't count the majority, okay, what is this? We're going to call it a statistical majority. This is where we just say, look, the chances are, because of what we see in the world, that this is this case. Okay, what's the example they bring? Kigon katan uktana. Okay, so Rashi says there's a machloket in Yevamot, and we're going to come back to Rabbi Meir at the very end today's stuff. Machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Okay, I'm going to look at Rashi and read for a minute. So katan uktana deplige Rabbanan aleda Rabbi Meir b'Yevamot. They have a disagreement. Tnan yabam katan shabal Yevama ktana. We have a yabam. His brother died without children. And his brother was married to a woman who had not reached the age of maturity. And the brother had not yet reached the age of maturity. Now, there's a clear arayot in the Torah. It's a forbidden relation for a brother to marry his brother's wife. Even if the brother has died, a brother can't marry the wife of his brother. However, in a case of yibum, where he's supposed to basically have a child in place of, right, to replace the fact that the brother didn't have a child and to continue the brother's name, he's supposed to marry the widow. And that overrides the Torah law. What's the problem here? Well, in the case where he actually had relations with the Yevama Ktana, yigdelu ze im ze. They can remain married, even though, what's the concern? There's a concern that maybe he is a saris or she's an aylonit. Maybe there are people who are not able to bear children. We don't know yet. They haven't reached the age of maturity. So we don't know if they have potential or not. So we're going to say, "V'lo chayshinam." We're not concerned, according to the rabbis, shematim aylonit o hu saris. Now, what would be the problem? Nimtza pogea b'eshet achiv shelo b'mkom mitzvah. The only reason we're going to allow this relation is to have children. But right, so once they've reached the age of maturity, we assume, now this is another, not necessarily assumption, but we assume they can bear children. But if she never develops signs of maturity and he never develops signs of maturity, there's a small number of people in the world that won't develop these. This is not exactly the same as someone nowadays who can't have children. We're talking about someone who never has physical signs of maturity. We don't have to worry that maybe that's the case. And then every moment they're together, they're basically going against the Torah law of him being with his brother's wife. So we don't make them, right, if they've already engaged in relations, we don't make them separate right now. We allow them to remain married based on the statistical majority that most women are not ayloniyot, most men are not sarisim. So that's the statistical majority. Now, Rabbi Meir is chayish l'miuta, okay? He is concerned for the minority. He's always worried if there's a minority of people, we have to be concerned for them. This is what we call a statistical majority. It's not that we can count how many people in the world are not sarisim and how many are, right? Or how many are ayloniyot, how many are not. It's just we know that there's a statistical majority, that the chances are. So that's what we want to source for. Okay, that's what we're looking for. Now, okay, if you look at the study guide today, there's a study guide. If you take a quick look at the study guide, and that's going to help us with the structure of our entire daf. Okay, here's share it over in a minute. Let's try that again. Okay, so if you look at the chart, we basically have 10 rabbis, okay, Rabbi Elazar, Marbury, Ravina, going all the way down to Rabashi, usually ends our sugyot. We are going to have these 10 opinions. Okay, we're going to go like this. What's the source in the Torah for we follow the majority? Then they're going to explain how we get from here that there's a majority. They're almost all of them. We're going to start with a pasuk. Okay, there's a verse in the Torah that says it. Then we're going to have rejection, okay, or a possible rejection. Some of the rejections we're going to resolve, okay, the teruts. Some of them we're not going to resolve, okay? So that's the structure for today's stuff, okay? So if you want to follow along with that, that will help you. Okay. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Okay, here's a siman, zman, shevach, mechanesh. That's a siman for the names of the rabbis, okay? Not for the content of it, but the names of the rabbis. Atimi resha shel olah. We get it from the head of the korban olah. Okay. What is that? Damar kra, v'nitach otan l'nitacheha. You're supposed to cut up the animal. The korban olah all gets burnt on the altar, but we don't burn the animal whole. We cut it into parts, but it's not like we just chop it. We cut it. There's the head, there's the legs, right? Each leg is separate. If you remember, we learned this because we learned that the kohanim bring the pieces up the ramp, and there's the one who holds the head in one hand and the leg in the other hand. Remember, there's the parts, and the kohanim, there's many kohanim that get involved because they carry it up the ramp to the altar. Anyway, the head of the olah. Damar kra, the pasuk says, nitach otah l'nitacheh, cut it into parts. But the word otah comes to teach us, otah l'nitachim v'lo nitacheha l'nitachim. Okay, specifically, you cut up the animal into parts, but you don't cut up the parts into parts. This is the important part, meaning, since we're learning it from the head of the olah, what we want to focus here is, you don't cut the head of the korban olah into parts. Okay, what does that have to do with rov? Okay, this is a very surprising proof for majority. We go by the majority. V'nichush shemani kev chum shel moach. Maybe there's a hole in the membrane of the brain, and therefore, what's the problem? If you can't cut open the head because you can't cut the nitachim, once it's in its part, you can't cut it anymore. Well, then you can't cut it open. You can't look inside to see if there was a problem, a hole in the membrane of the brain. Now, if there was a hole in the membrane of the brain, the animal would be a treifa. You can't bring a korban, right? A korban has to be a kosher shechita. Now, it's true nobody's eating this, but it doesn't matter. It can't be a treifa. Remember, if there's a hole in the membrane of the brain, that's a siman of treifa. Okay, we haven't gotten to all the simanim of treifa, but we're going to get there. So what do they assume here? Elalav mishum damrinan zilba taruba. It must be we follow the majority. Okay? The majority of animals don't have a hole in the membrane of their brain. So follows the statistical majority. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's not a good proof. Mimai. Dilma defalele ubadikle. Maybe you cut it open on one side, but not completely. Okay? And what we thought was you would chop, right? What does it mean? Don't break it into pieces. It means to chop it completely into two separate pieces. Take the head and cut it into two pieces. But if you open it on one side and allow to look inside the brain and leave it connected on the other side, that you could do. And how do we know that? If it's because, well, you can't cut it into parts, but you cut it into parts, but the parts you can't cut up into other parts. That's only when you chop it completely. But if you leave it connected on one side, there's no problem. So that's not a proof because you must be able to check that for being a treifa. Mar berei Ravina Amar. Okay, second option. Let's learn it from breaking a bone in the korban pesach. Now it says don't break the bones of the korban pesach, right? When it's a very famous halacha, right? Don't break the bones. It's kind of famous because it's like what's the thing about breaking the bones? Why is that such a problem? Anyway, that's a whole interesting in and of itself, but not for today. Same exact way we're going to try to learn it. Well, if you can't break the bones, then when you're in the skull, you can't get underneath to check the membrane of the brain. So if you can't break the bone, you won't be able to check. And if you can't check, what does that prove? Does it not mean that we follow the majority? And the majority of animals don't have a hole in the membrane of their brain. And therefore, we can assume it's not a treifa, even though we really didn't check. Wait. Why are you proving it for the fact that you can't break the bone? There's other ways without breaking the bone that you can, without cut it, right? What's etzem tishburo with a knife? In fact, it's with a big cleaver. Okay? But dilma demanich gumarta ale bekalele. Theoretically, you could put a coal on top of the bone and burn it. And once you burn it, you'll be able to remove the bone and get underneath. Ubadikle, and then you can check it. Tanya. Now, how do we know that you can put a coal on it? Maybe etzem tishburo means you can't break any of the bones at all. But, right, doesn't matter how you do it. Well, it says in a braita, hamechatech bagidim, you're allowed to cut the sinews. You just can't cut the bones. That's not relevant for us. But hasoref ba'atzamot, if you burn the bones, ein bo mishum shvirat etem. That's not a problem. You didn't transgress that prohibition. So there's other ways to get there, so we must get there in those other ways. Okay, so it's the same kind of suggestion, both with the head of the ola and with the breaking the bones of the korban pesach, but in the end, we see there's a way to get around that where you do check it, which means we can't learn anything about statistical majorities. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, this one's going to be very similar. I want you to notice, by the way, and we're going to talk about this more as we go on, and we'll categorize all of them, but we're starting with the world of kodshim, which makes sense. We're in the middle of kodshim, okay? Maybe because, right, we just finished zvachim and menachot, so they're going back to all sorts of issues relating to sacrifices, right? If I had to ask you, where would you find laws of majority, you probably wouldn't have thought of the world of kodshim, but maybe because we are in kodshim, they start with kodshim. So now they say, okay, what about the aliyah? What is the aliyah? It's the fatty tail. And in a korban shlamim, when you bring a peace offering, you have to burn the fatty tail. It goes with the imurim, all the parts that's supposed to be burned on the altar, also the fatty tail of the sheep, specifically in the sheep, because the sheep has a fat tail. Ta'amar Rachmana, chelbo ha'aliyah tmima. Says the chel of the fat of the tail of this aliyah, tmima, needs to be burned complete, whole, right? Tmima means complete. Lichush shema nifseka chut hashidra. But wait, if you have to burn it completely, it means you can't cut it open and you can't check that maybe, now we're going to explain is the Koran actually has a pretty, not pretty, but a nice picture of it, of the vertebrae of the sheep goes into the tail area. Okay, so if that's the case, don't you have to check it to see that maybe there was a problem in the vertebrae in the chut hashidra? So, and you're not checking it if you're taking the whole fatty tail and burning it without cutting it. Again, we're going to assume. Majority of animals are not treifa there. They don't have a problem in the vertebrae, and therefore it's okay. And there's your proof. Wait, maybe you cut the tail off from the lower part where there is no bone anymore, and then you don't have any of the vertebrae in there. Though the pasuk says, okay, we just read the words before. Where are you supposed to take it off from? From opposite the eitzah. Okay, what is the eitzah? Eitzah usually means advice. Okay, so Amar Rahmana makom shaklayot yoatzot. It's a weird use of the word yoatzot, but it's where the kidneys advise. Okay, I assume that means where the kidneys function. And the space where the kidneys function, that's where you're supposed to, and that's basically where the kidneys are. Next to that, that's where you're supposed to cut it. And there you still have the vertebrae going. So it must be that you are cutting off vertebrae, and therefore you wouldn't be able to check if it's a treifa because you can't cut it open because it has to be tmima, whole. Now, they say, wait a minute, mima, dilma de patachla ubatikla. What do you mean? Maybe after you cut the aliyah off, you open it and you check it, just like we talked about the head, the kroma moth. V'im mishum tmima, and if you want to say, well, it has to be complete, just like we said before. That's only if you're going to chop it in half. But if you're going to leave it connected on one side, you are allowed to check it. And again, we have no proof. Okay, so these were all very, very similar types of proofs. Number one, they all came from the world of kodshim. Korbanot, sacrifices. They all suggested that you're not checking for some sort of sign of treifa, and that must prove that we just must follow statistical majority here. In the end, the response was no. In all of these cases, you actually can cut it. You just can't cut it completely and sever it into two completely separate parts. As long as you leave them somewhat together, you can open them, you can check them. So none of them served as proofs. Now we're going to go into the next three, are going to be from something that is sort of kodshim, but not really kodshim, okay? We're going to slowly move out of kodshim, but not completely, because you're going to see. Now, Rav Sheshet bered Rav Idi Amar Atime Egla Arufa. We're going to learn from the Egla Arufa. This is the ceremony that you do where you break the back of a calf, a heifer. You're going to do it when someone dies in between two cities, and we don't know who killed this person, right? Someone was murdered. So we say which city is the closest. We measure that city. The elders have to come out to this stream. They break the back of the neck of the animal. So how do we learn it from here? It's going to connect again to the treifa issue, even though you don't eat the egla rufa, okay, and you don't sacrifice the egla rufa. So we're going to have to see who cares whether it's a treifa or not. Ha'arufa kishish leima tahave. So they say, and this is going to be just like the previous ones, which is the animal. Now you break the back of its neck, but it's called the egla ha'arufa. That was arof. You basically cut the back of the neck, and the rest of the animal, the darshan, has to be left whole. You don't chop it up. So again, if you can't open it, it sounds like, because you have to leave it whole. If you have to leave it whole, you can't check if it's a treifa. Right? Maybe it's a treifa. It must be we follow the majority, and most animals are in treifas. Now, the chitema, what you might be thinking, my nafkamina, who cares if it's a treifa? What's the relevance whether it's a treifa? Ha'amre debe Rabbi Yanai. Well, the house of Rabbi Yanai in their school, Beit Midrash, they darshaned kaparak tivba ke kodashim. Now, this animal is supposed to atone for whoever murdered, right, for the city that didn't take responsibility for their murderer. And therefore, what do you see? If it has kapara, Rabbi Yanai says it's like kodashim. If it's like kodashim, well, then it has to have the rules of kodashim. So even though this isn't kodashim, we're going to treat it like kodashim. Okay, same thing with the next two. Rabba bar Rav Shila Amar Ater mi para duma, the red heifer, right? Which is also not a sacrifice, right? But what do? We slaughter the red heifer, we burn it, then we take the ashes and we use it for purification purposes. So, right, purification from impurity from the dead. So, Ater mi para duma, da Amar Rachmana, v'shachat v'saraf. So these words are near each other. So we learn you have to burn it, you have to slaughter it, then burn it. So what's the drasha here? Mashchitak shishlema, asrefatak shishlema. Exact same idea. We, just like we slaughter it when it's whole. Okay, you can't slaughter an animal when it's cut up into parts. You can only slaughter it when it's whole. Also, you burn it only when it's whole. Now, again, if you're going to burn it when it's whole, that means you're not going to be able to check whether it's a treifa. Now, elilav mishum da'amrina, right? So, sorry, v'lichush dama treifa. Why aren't we concerned it's a treifa? And elilav mishum da'amrina and zil bataruba, isn't it? Because we follow the majority. The chitema my nafkamina. Now, if you say, why do we need the paraduma to not be a treifa? Who cares? Nobody's eating it. Nobody's sacrificing it. Well, chata karya just like in the beginning, the previous one, it called it kapara, just like kochim. This calls it chatat, which is obviously sin offering. And even though it's not an offering, it's called chatat. So because it's called chatat, it's like kochim. And it can't be a treifa. And therefore, we see that this. So these, by the way, these two, in the end, do work because we don't say you can open them in some way. Here we seem to assume, both in paraduma and in egla rufa, that theoretically you can prove from there zil bataruba. Rav Acha bar Yaakov amar, atya misir hamishtalech. We have another one. It's not really a korban, but sort of a korban. We have the scapegoat on Yom Kippur. We throw off a cliff. The Torah says, take the two sirim. If you remember, one goes to God, one goes to Azazel. We throw it off a cliff. Shiyush nehem shavim. They both have to be equal, right? We start off with two, and then we do the goral. We see which one goes where. The lichus turning out amabeh. Why are we concerned? Maybe one is a treifa. Elalav mishum damrinan zil bataruba. It must be. Now, when they say chad minayu treifa, what they mean is, right, because one will be slaughtered, we can open it and check it, okay? But the one that we're not going to slaughter, we don't have a way to check it. So the chad minayu, one of them, we mean the one that's going to go to Azazel. Shouldn't we be worried it's a treifa? Elalav mishum damrinan zil bataruba. In other words, we can assume it's not a treifa because of the majority. The chitema my nafkalamina. Now you might say, who cares? The Shiur Azazel gets thrown off a cliff. What's the difference if it's a treifa? The one that ends up going to La Hashem, we're going to check after we slaughter it. But the one that goes off a cliff, who cares if we don't check it? In the end, it's going La Azazel. No one's eating it. It's not a sacrifice. Well, that won't work because ha'in goral kovea Azazel ela b'davar ra'oi l'Hashem. Because we know that you can only use the animal for the goral to figure out, right, is an animal that could potentially been brought as a sacrifice. So even though in the end this one got designated as Azazel, we still have to know that it's not a treifa because when the two Seirim stand there, when we do the goral, they both have to be theoretically capable or actually capable of being sacrificed, even though one of them won't be. And okay, so maybe we check it after we throw it off the cliff. We check and see if it's a treifa. Well, that's impossible because Bahatnan, it says in the Mishnah, lo haya magia lemachatzit har ad shnasai verim evarim. When they would throw it off, these are the descriptive Mishnayot, if you remember. This isn't, it has to happen this way, but they would describe the way it happened in the temple was they would throw it off the cliff and it wouldn't even get to halfway and it would already be in parts, like completely fallen apart. And once it's in parts broken up like that, you're not going to be able to tell, was it a treifa or not? It's impossible. So it must be, so here's another one. These three actually could be proofs, okay? The Igla Rufa, the Paraduma, and the Shiur Azazel could theoretically be proofs that we follow the majority. Rav Meri Amar, Atya mimakeh aviv v'imo. Finally leaving the world of kachim, and we're getting into the world of damages. Okay, so here we're going to talk about someone who hit his mother and father. This is an interesting one. The Torah says this person gets killed, the death penalty. Now, if a person hits their father specifically, what's the problem? Dilma, v'lichush dilma lav avivhu. Maybe the person's not their father. No one ever really knows, right? Without DNA testing in those days, you can't really be certain that the father was the father. So how do we, if you ever thought about this, how do we kill this child? Again, they're obviously a grown-up child, but how do we kill them based on the fact that we don't know 100% that it's the father? Elalav mishum damrinan zil bataruba. Now this one is very different than all the others because this is based on a rov that relates to behavior of people, which is, and if you notice, after all the others, it just ended with zil bataruba. Here they're going to say, v'rov be'ilot achar haba'al. Most relations a woman has are with her husband. We can assume that's the basic statistical majority here. And therefore, right, so this is different because Rov, beimot, or treifot, or rov, right? All those kind of rovs that we saw, well, I'm sorry, rov, beimot, or not treifot, most animals are not treifas, don't have a hole in the chroma moach, or don't have a, right? All those that we've been talking about is a reality of, the majority of the, this is the way people behave. It's a little bit different. Someone asked in the previous class how this is different from chazaka. There's not the chazaka we talked about yesterday, but in many times we've employed this principle. There's a chazaka that people will behave in this manner. And the truth is, theoretically, this could have been called chazaka instead of rov. To think about that more, is there really a difference? Usually chazaka relates to human behavior and rov relates to facts on the ground or the way things are. This is really the way people behave. Okay, so it's different than all the others. I'm just pointing it out. Not that I have anything unique to say about it, but just note it's a little bit different. And I think there's like a fine line. Is there really a difference between rov and chazaka in a case like this? Right. So again, generally chazaka is human behavior. Chazaka that people will generally collect their loans by the date of the loan. There's certain things that we can assume about human behavior, and this is one of them. So now we assume that most people, right, most women who have relations and have a child, it's from their husband, and that must be why we can kill this child based on the statistical majority. But mimai, dilma kagon shayu avivi imo. Okay, here's a really creative explanation. Chavushim bebeita asurim. I don't remember learning this when we learned Sanhedrin and when we killed the Makav Vivimo, but now they're suggesting maybe the only time we kill a person who hits their father is in a case where the mother and father were imprisoned together and there was no one else around, and it's obvious that he's the father. That would be a unique situation where it would be completely obvious, to which the Gemara says that's not a completely obvious case, because there's nobody who's really checking to make sure who she's sleeping with, and it could be, right, there's jail wardens, right, there's always someone else around. Unfortunately, we know how much rape is rampant in jails, maybe also in those days, and maybe that's why they were mentioning this, I don't know, but there's no way to really know. So again, we have a possible proof for statistical majority from here. Okay, next one. Rav Kahana Amar, Atem mehoreget hanefesh. Okay, another kind of similar thing, but different. If someone kills someone else, or a murderer gets the death penalty. To Amar Rahmana Katle, Torah says they get killed, just like the previous person. Now here, what's the issue? We're going to get back to treifa, but not treifa of an animal. Lichush dilma treifa hava, maybe the person that was murdered was a treifa. Now, if you murder someone who is about to die anyway, you don't get the death penalty. Now, how do we know? Maybe the person was sick. Maybe they had some disease that we didn't see. Okay, now, Ella, right? So treifa here would be like in an animal, where if the animal's going to die within 12 months, right? Or again, however we define treifa, which we haven't really gotten to. We keep touching around it, but we haven't gotten to all the topics of what makes someone a treifa, an animal, but also a human. It would be the same thing. So you wouldn't get the death penalty. So how do we kill someone? Maybe we should be concerned that the murdered person was a treifa. It must be we follow the majority. Most people aren't treifa. Now, how would you check if a person was a treifa? So you do an autopsy, right? So now they're saying, maybe you would do an autopsy, check the body, check that there wasn't some other problem inside. Well, we know that autopsies are issues in halacha. Hakaminava. Well, we're destroying the body of a dead person. That's not allowed. It's disgracing the body. We have to have kavod hamet, respect for the dead. Well, maybe you'd say, unless we do perform autopsies, right? There's different debates about it. I'm not a halachic expert on it, but there's certain circumstances where it is warranted. This would be a good one, because now, even though the murderer murdered that person, they shouldn't really get extra rights here. But in order to save a life, and if the person really murdered someone who was about to die anyway, then they shouldn't get the death penalty. To save the murderer's life, you would think it would be okay to do an autopsy, and even though it's a disgrace to the body of the dead person. But that won't even help. Why? Because now it might help if we find something definitive. But we still, in this case, would have to follow some sort of statistical majority, because maybe in the place where he murdered him, right, he stuck the sword in, maybe there was a hole there. Okay, this is like with the wolf, right? Remember the case with the wolf, where basically someone slaughters an animal, and then the wolf walks away with the innards and we never check the innards. And when it comes back, there's a hole. Maybe now there was more of a reason to think that maybe he nibbled away at the hole where the hole already was, right? Even there we said we don't worry about that. But here we're saying there is some, even if we check and there's nothing at all that shows the person's a treifa, it still has to rely on a statistical majority because it could be that specifically where the person was stabbed to death, could be there was a hole there and we'll never see it because the person's cut up at that point now, right? They're damaged there because of the stabbing, but it could be there was damage there before and we'll never know. So we still have to rely on a statistical majority in order to kill a murderer in every situation, basically, even if we could perform an autopsy. Ravina Amar, Atime Edim Zomimim, we could learn it from false witnesses. Da'amar Rahmana, what's the punishment for Edim Zomim? Again, it's not any false witness, there's a unique those who are makot, those who are doing the makot challenge now. Vasitem lo kasher zamam. What's the punishment for edim zamim? Right? If two people come and say we witnessed a murder, and then two people come and say you claim the murder was on this day at this time. We were with you somewhere else. There's no way you could have testified. We've turned those edim into edim zamim, and they get the punishment that they tried to do to the person. So they wanted to get the person murdered, killed, basically, because they claimed he was a murderer. So they get the death penalty. Now, again, why should they get the death penalty? Lichush, same issue. Dilma haftas idube treifahava. Maybe they were testifying, the person they testified against was going to die anyway. So that person, if he had murdered, right, what happened here? They claimed Joe, let's just say for, argument's sake, his name is Joe. They claimed Joe was a murderer. Now, if Joe was a treifa, then they never would have succeeded in killing him. Or if they did get him killed, let's put it this way. What's their punishment? What they tried to do to Joe, right, who was an innocent bystander. Okay, they just called him a murderer. Now, what they tried to do to Joe was kill him. So basically, why did they get killed? Because they tried to murder someone else. But if they tried to murder someone who was anyway going to get killed because he was anyway going to die because he was a treifa, then they shouldn't get the death penalty. So maybe Joe was a treifa, and we don't know. Now again, how do you know someone's a treifa? Well, you cut up their body after they die. Now, what's the issue here? Now, right, so again, we're going to assume Joe wasn't a treifa because we're going to follow majority, and that's why we're going to kill those two edim zamimim who tried to kill Joe by framing him as a murderer. But now, maybe you say we check Joe. Check his health. Now, again, we don't have, I saw someone wrote before MRIs, right? We don't have those kind of methods in those days. We don't have ways to check. The only way to check is once he's dead. Now, he's clearly not dead now. How do we know he's clearly not dead? I mean, unless some fluke he happened to die. But in most cases of edim zomimim, the person is still alive because halachically they have to be alive because b'hatanya b'Rebbe Yomil lo harago neheragim, harago ein neheragim. This is a big principle in edim zomimim. The pasuk says, like they tried to do to their brother. But if they actually succeeded, meaning, let's say the court case went through, they murdered, they killed, they gave capital punishment to the person they claimed was the murderer, to Joe. Joe got convicted, he was killed, and then they edim zomimim, it turns out we find out they were false witnesses, then they actually don't get the punishment. It's a very weird halacha about edim zomimim. It's only kasher zamam, what they tried to do to Joe. So they won't be convicted if Joe's already dead. If Joe was already dead, we could theoretically check the body. But since Joe is not, again, we have to go back to the issue we talked about before, but it'll destroy the body. But again, we'll allow it to save the lives of the witnesses, false witnesses. But he's not dead, right? Unless, like I said, by a fluke, you happen to drop dead. But he's not going to be dead, for halachic reasons, because if they already killed him, they won't get killed. And the only way they will get killed, right? So again, let's explain the words. Lo harago, if they didn't succeed in getting him killed, then neharagim, then they get killed. But harago, if they did, they won't get killed, ein neharagim, and therefore there's no way to check his body. So that would be, again, another situation where we must hold probably wasn't a treifa because majority of people aren't treifa. Finally, the last one. And this is going to have kind of a twist at the end because we're going to, even though some of the suggestions that we saw were rejected, some of them actually were accepted. By the time we get to the end of this, we're going to actually reject everything now. So Rav Ashi says, we come back to shchita. I just want to show you again the order. We started with kodshim, 3 cases of kodshim. We went to 3 cases of things that are like kodshim, the egla rufa, the sir lazazel, and the para aduma, not in that order. Then we went to the three in the world of death penalties, makeh, vivi, mo, rotzeach, and idim zomamin. So there's like 3, 3, 3. And now we go back to shchita, which is our topic, which, like I said, you could say we got here in the sugya because specifically of the question we asked yesterday of chazaka, so now they're asking about rov, okay, which are all sorts of principles that we use, and they're legalistic principles. Well, chazaka, presumptive status. This is the way it was. We'll assume it stays that way until proven otherwise. Rov, statistical majority. We can go by the fact that most are like this. Okay, but also it connects to our issue of treifa, as we're going to see right now within shchita. So Rav Ashi Amar, ate mishchita atzma. The fact that we allow shchita to Amar Rachman shchot be'echol. The Torah says slaughter and eat. V'lichush. Now we are supposed to check for treifas, right? But he says here v'lichush shema bimkom. Well, we're going to talk about that tomorrow. Really, how much do we have to check for treifa once we slaughter an animal? But right now, not yet. Let's talk about it soon. V'lichush shema bimkom nekev kashachit. Maybe, just like we talked about this before with the murderer, maybe you stabbed them in a place where there was already a hole. Maybe you slaughtered the animal where there was already a treifa, and you have no way, in a case of shchita, to ever know for sure that there wasn't some sort of treifa. You could check other treifas to see, was the leg broken? Was there's lots of things you could check, okay? But you can't check if there was a siman of treifa right where you slaughtered it, because now you cut it completely. Maybe it was cut before. We don't know. So, the fact that we allow you to eat kosher, right? We allow you to eat meat, and you don't have to worry it's a treifa, is based on laws of rov. So that's the last one, and that seems like a pretty solid proof. However, comes the next section and says, Amar Rav Ashi, Amarita l'shmata kameja Rav Kahana. So Rav Ashi says, listen, when I told this to Rav Kahana, he said the following thing. He had a problem with my claim. Or, Amrela, some people say, Rav Kahana kamei Rav Shimi, that Rav Kahana brought Rav Ashi's answer in front of Rav Shimi. V'amrele. And Rav Shimi said, or Rav Kahana said to Rav Ashi, V'dilma hecha de efshar efshar, hecha de lo efshar lo efshar. He says, maybe this whole thing, and this actually is really a question on all the other opinions. Maybe we follow a statistical majority in a case where we sorry, let me say it right. Dilma de efshar efshar, where you can check, you check, and you don't rely on a statistical majority. And hecha de lo efshar, lo efshar. In other words, when you can't, you can't. And then we can rely on a statistical majority. And then it would be saying, we can take all these proofs that we learned and say, and he's starting really with treifa, but then we're going to extend it with shchita. We're going to extend it to any proof we have, basically, because all those proofs were like, well, you had no choice, right? You couldn't check, you couldn't this, you couldn't that. So obviously you're relying on a statistical majority. But that's all only in situations where you have no choice, because you can't, you're stuck. And then we're going to say like this, all those cases basically proved that when you have no choice, we'll rely on a statistical majority. We're not going to say, okay, we won't kill the makeh vivimo because maybe, right, we have no way to prove it. It's really the father, okay? But if you have a way to check, okay, like nowadays, maybe we wouldn't do it unless we took a DNA test because we have a way to check and we're not going to rely on any majority here, okay? That would be a good example. So in the shchita case, right, we're going to check for treifas that we can check for. We just don't need to check for treifas that we can't check. Can you check if there was a hole in the windpipe when the windpipe is cut already and there's no way to check? And then that wouldn't prove anything. Now, how does he prove that I know I'm right about this? De'ilo temahachi leRabbi Meir dechayish lemiuta hachinami delo achel bisra. This is an interesting proof. Rabbi Meir, I told you we get back to him at the end of the daf. Rabbi Meir says that we're worried about, in the Katan Ketana case, a statistical minority, right? In the case where the rabbis hold by majority, he says we hold by the minority. So let's go back to the Katan Ketana. He says they can't live together because maybe she's an aylonit and maybe he's a saris, right? He's worried for those unique cases, and the rabbis aren't. Now, if he's worried about all these minority cases, then hachinami delo achel bisra, then he'll never eat meat. Because if he's choshesh l'miut, even in a case where you can't check, okay, then he'll never be able to eat meat because he'll say we don't hold by statistical majorities in cases where you can't check. No cases can you hold by a statistical majority, which means he would never eat meat. Okay, now maybe. Okay, so what? Maybe Rabbi Meir was vegetarian, right? Now, Rabbi Meir, you have to remember it. Now, the Torah says you can eat meat, but Rabbi Meir's choshesh l'miyuta is by rabbinic law. So he says, yeah, it's true, by Torah law you can eat it and rely on it, but I'm going to be stringent and say that by rabbinic law you can't hold by statistical majorities. You have to worry about that minority, and therefore maybe he really wouldn't eat meat. Okay, because he'd say maybe you slaughtered it specifically where there was a hole. If you want to say, yeah, maybe Rabbi Meir was vegetarian, never ate meat. But what do you mean? Pesach v'kodeshim ma'ikal meimar. In other words, he thinks no one can eat meat, not just him, but he thinks no one, because he doesn't just rule stringently for himself. He said everyone should not eat meat. Then everyone should never eat korbanot. And the Torah says you have to eat korbanot, right? You have to eat the Pesach. You have to eat this. So you have to basically say, Ella, okay, I'm going a little into tomorrow's daf, and we'll start with this again tomorrow, but hecha de efshar efshar, hecha de lo efshar lo efshar. You have to say that Rabbi Meir would say, we hold by the minority when you can, but when you can't, right, when there's no choice, we're going to basically allow you even to hold by the majority. But then again, what's that going to say? Hachanami, hecha de efshar efshar, hecha de lo efshar lo efshar. Any proof that you brought, basically, all those proofs were cases where there was no choice. So we're going to say that can only teach you that we're going to follow the majority, just like Rabbi Meir would even in those cases. You can follow the majority only in a case where you have no choice. But if you can figure out, is this person part of that majority or not, or right, is this a trait, is it not, you have a responsibility to check. And you can't just do that. Okay, so we're going to start tomorrow with a very interesting Rashi on this. If anyone wants to get ahead and read the Rashi, it's very, very interesting. Okay, so we're going to start with that. It's on tomorrow's daf anyway. We're going to start with it in tomorrow's class. So today is very easy daf to summarize. We had one question. Where do you know acharei rabim as zil bataruba? We follow the majority, not in Sanhedrin and Teish Tachanuyot where you can count, but a statistical majority. How do you know we follow that? We had 10 different possibilities, 3, 3, and 3, as I mentioned before, plus the last one being shchita. And in the end, though, the Gemara rejects all of them and basically says those are only cases where it's impossible to check. But perhaps where it's possible to check, we don't follow, and we don't have then a source for that. Now we know we do follow majority, even when you can check. And then the question is going to be, and that's what Rashi is going to deal with, so where does that come from if in the end we really have no proof for that? With that, I'll leave you in suspense till tomorrow, and we'll finish that up in the morning tomorrow. So wishing everyone a good day.